the Belt and Road Initiative, roughly speaking, is a Chinese geopolitical project to develop countries along what they call the land belt and the maritime road. And so that belt roughly stretches from mainland China up through across Xinjiang through Kazakhstan into Central Asia and down into the Middle East. And you know, you can look at different maps, different sort of viewpoints about where exactly it stretches down to the Middle East, over into Europe through Russia, and then the Maritime Silk Road, which goes off the coast of China through the South China Sea, up through the Strait of Malacca, you know, across India, Pakistan, and then over to East Africa. And so, generally speaking, you know, those two trade routes are of extreme importance for the security of China as a nation. I mean, most of their imports, most of the raw materials that fuel their economic engine flow across the Indian Ocean, you know, oil coming down from the Middle East, raw materials, you know, think like coltan, cobalt, etc., coming from Africa over the Indian Ocean, down to the Strait of Malacca, and up to the Chinese coast. So huge geostrategic importance. And you know, China is not necessarily a naval power, at least not yet. So it's very important for them to have influence at different nodes along that route and to have alternative routes into China. So one example of a special economic zone project that they've developed in on the coast of Pakistan, it's called the Port of Gudar. You know, basically a small fishing village, essentially, and then a tremendous amount of uh, construction or manufacturing capacity, infrastructural development, investment from China flowed into Pakistan and developed, starting with the port of Gwadar, a trade corridor flowing all the way up through Pakistan into Xinjiang province in China. So, kind of an alternate route for goods, materials, oil, etc., that that could go through Pakistan instead of going down to the Strait of Malacca. Obviously, more costly, not as efficient, but building an alternative trade route that the Chinese could control and influence in a country that you know was starving for investment, for infrastructural development,
And
and
should we also
for
just
yeah,
highlight
go ahead.
why China might want to be creating alternate trade routes? Basically, this is like a very high level geopolitical
Yeah.
point that America sort of ensures the
Mhm.
global order at the moment, and it is their trade routes that people sort of sail on. And so China doesn't want this or like this; they want to own their own trade routes, and this is like the big incentive of the BRI.
Entirely. I mean, in many ways, the United States subsidizes the world trade
Mm,
system via its
100%.
maritime
American
security,
taxpayers
and and so
voted
yeah,
in. Companies work in
and
China.
so
It is
China
about
obviously
50%
recognizes this
subsidized by the United States taxpayer. The fact that I can afford whatever it is here.
totally. And in the story, you know, the kind of post World War II Bretton Woods system, you know, is one that is very much defined by
Yeah.
that geopolitical reality. And China recognizes this, of course, and to them, you know, given the fact that a lot of their well-being runs along these maritime, well, the sources of their well-being, economic development, capacity, etc., runs along these maritime routes that are insured, defended, and so on by the United States Navy. They have an incentive to develop alternative trade routes that they have more control over. So, nodes along that maritime Silk Road, as I've mentioned, but also the development of trade corridors going over land along the traditional Silk Road route that we're all familiar with, flowing through mainland China, up across Central Asia, down to the Middle East, over to Europe, and you see this a lot of rail infrastructure, a lot of railway special economic zones. There's one excellent example in Kazakhstan. There's the port or the what do they call it, Alexa? It has an interesting name because the dry port of
Of
Kurgas, I believe.
Gorgas. Yes.
Kurgas. They on the border of Xinjiang and Kazakhstan. The rail moves through China, which is set on a particular gauge system, and then it goes to the border and it's moved off of the gauge onto what the old Soviet gauge that still existed in Kazakhstan. So they move the shipping containers off the one gauge onto the other, and then move along through Kazakhstan to various other cities there, or beyond into Russia and further west. So to summarize, China has been developing these trade corridors. There's a massive geopolitical incentive for them to do so, and also building up special economic zones along this route creates opportunities for people living in these countries where China is leveraging its own political and economic power to gain sway over the politics of these countries in some cases, to develop infrastructure that is financed by the Chinese. This is where you get into the debt trap diplomacy stuff. Maybe Alexa, you can get into that a little bit, but primarily these special economic zones, many of them are driven by state interests of the Chinese government. They operate the same way, and they provide many of the same incentives that we've discussed these zones having, regardless of who initiates them, or who the anchor tenants are. But in many cases, you have these zones being kind of spawned out of the anchor tenant profile of a Chinese multinational corporation, which is looking to bring raw materials back to China, looking to build up infrastructure, create a new market for Chinese goods potentially. There's also a very interesting story. I'm not sure how, because my data is not very recent on this, but so many resources have been mobilized in China over the past 15 to 20 years to develop and build up cities within China. They have all of this overflowing construction capacity, and a lot of that's being exported to other countries. I mean, even as far as Serbia, West Africa, Central America. I mean, it's you find Chinese construction companies all over the world that are building massive works, huge bridges, railways,
Yeah,
ports,
just an
etc.
interesting
So,
point on that, which
yeah, I
maybe
kind
might be interesting to you guys here in Stockholm. Massive infrastructure project for the last fucking 5 6 years to build a big bridge in Slussen, which is one of the main centers of town where most of the buses and trains sort of run through for work. And they bought a bridge from China, and it was like a big thing here. But that's an example, I guess, of these Chinese construction companies, finding jobs all the way over here in Stockholm.
Mhm. As we were in Rwanda, we'd actually gone south down the road from Kigali into Bugesera, and the road at the time was an extremely wide dirt road, and we were interested in why it was that wide, because one could really swerve left and right without much problem. But we'd started seeing signs from the China Road Engineering Corporation, for example, and it was very clear that two lane expressway was getting built by China. And during my time in Belgrade, I mean, whenever I'm home, there's Huawei security cameras being set up in downtown, whereas the ring road around the city has a lot of these tunnels, overpasses, bridges, etc., also being built by the China Harbor Engineering Corporation, which was always strange to me because they're building roads and tunnels and not harbors, but whatever. And China, the Chinese overflow of construction was created during the Hu Jintao era of the 2000s, and in 2013. Xi Jinping was like, "Well, we can't build any more of
Yeah,
these ghost cities." And if you want to learn more about ghost cities, Wade Shepard is a great source for that. And we have nothing more to build, because in the 2002 to 2013 period, China built a motorway system that's more extensive than what the U.S. has with the Eisenhower Interstate, which is just ridiculous to think about. And they had to figure out some way to offload all of this construction material, and also if they would start exporting this construction surplus, they would be able to thus escape the middle income trap expressed previously, because they would be able to no longer have they would no longer have to construct more for their own domestic consumption, but rather
Yeah.
they'd rather be able to hit other markets, as it were. And one of the obvious choices was emerging countries in Europe. So Belarus, for example, they have the Great Stone Industrial Park that China is building in consort with Belarus. There's various and infrastructural projects going on in Europe. If I'm not mistaken, the port of Piraeus was. As the largest port in Europe was expanded by the China Harbour Engineering Corporation. So there's a lot of these projects that took place. But I think the one that is the most fascinating to international relations scholars, particularly, is the debt trap diplomacy in sub-Saharan Africa, wherein China is offering the construction of these very elaborate engineering projects like dams, and it's not just bridges and roads. They're doing power generation. They're doing transshipment. Intermodal terminals.
Although
So
we can't understate the
pretty involved
importance of
infrastructure.
bridges and roads.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as a friend of mine once said, if the U.S. foreign policy could be replaced with just one guy going around building roads, I'd have that any second. But and Preston will know who I'm talking about. In any case, the debt trap diplomacy comes in where these countries like Guinea-Bissau, for example, they don't have the liquidity necessary, or sometimes even the goods, because you've had situations in the past where Liberia, for example, sold lumber in exchange for infrastructure, whereas a lot of these countries, which are at a much lower level of development, they're forced to trade different things. Number one being debt, number two being mineral rights, or different forms of rights such as fishing rights or
Something
logging
natural
or
resources.
whatever. Yeah, natural resources in one way or another, and China's always looking for these resources that they can value add and move to China, because the decision makers in a lot of these companies, they're not necessarily that driven by the reduction of the middle income trap. Yes, that is what drives most of the national policy, but you're going to have a lot of local level decision makers who are like, hold on, I can make a lot of money by selling various types of exotic goods to Chinese consumers, and obviously I'm going to do that because they're individuals that are they're driven by their own interest, but also having China as a major patron and trade partner with a lot of these countries is good for China on the international stage. Where in 2000, I think that it was an even 50-50 split of which countries accepted Taiwan versus People's Republic of China, and now in 2021, I believe it's
It's like
only
four or five
one
countries.
country that. I think it's only one
Oh
actually
shit!
in Africa that still accepts Taiwan, and I think it's Eswatini, or Swaziland as
Yeah.
it used to be called. But that's it. That's the only one. And we can extrapolate from that what happened behind closed doors with a lot of these infrastructure deals, and it's just interesting to think about what are the various routes that China can undertake as far as operationalizing and making benefit from these investments.
Well, to be honest, I mean, this is a very happy thread for me to pull on, but we have gone far away from special economic zones, which might be disappointing to the listener. But I think it is good that we stick to explaining what the role of SEZs is in all of this, because naturally, obviously, the geopolitics of China and the BRI is endlessly fascinating, and also what it means for the global order and us as individuals here in Europe and America, and even in Latin America or Australia or Asia. But nonetheless, let's bring it back to Alexia. You just touched on the debt trap diplomacy, but maybe Preston, you could talk more about maybe what special economic zones with examples are doing on the BRI, and sort of like maybe what they mean, and tell me if that's not a specific enough of a question.
No, that's great. So again, you have the using the narrative that Alexa came forward with as far as Chinese corporations, Chinese government striking deals in the developing world, Central Asia, and and Africa. Let's use Africa as an example. Um, Kigali Free Zone, we kind of held on to that one for the majority of this, so I'll stick with it. When we were there and back in 2019, Alexa, I think maybe even mentioned this earlier in the podcast. There was a very apparent profile of Chinese business people in the Rwanda Development Board
Hmm.
office in Kigali. People going and registering their businesses, turning in paperwork. People that were working in office with RDB officials and planning, developing, uh, implementing policy. There's an extremely close relationship there. It's not one that you'll necessarily hear a lot about. It's not one that's necessarily even confirmed by the RDB or on their Chinese partners, but it's one that is very clear and apparent in the development of the incentive structure of a lot of these special economic zones in Africa. And it's one that again, it hits all the right notes in terms of regulatory concessions, tax breaks, et cetera, that you get from a special
Yeah.
economic zone. But the development and the threads are connected back to the experience and the influence of Chinese business partners or
So
the
we got to
Chinese
recognize
government,
maybe more
depending
incentives
on.
here than just good business.
Sure, sure. There there's some speculation as far as data protection that comes up in some cases, unconfirmed, but you have like Huawei developing data center infrastructure. There's a famous case of the African Union headquarters, which was, according to some reports, that was developed. The infrastructure for that entire installation was developed by the Chinese government or sponsored by it, and there's been some speculation that that was all of that data for something like 5 years or so was harvested
It's
by
probably
by the
insane.
Chinese government. Yeah, like copied every night in Shanghai or something like that. Um, so there is that element. There is that political element. They're looking for establishing an imprint, and one being recognized as sort of like the originator, the developer of this policy, bringing the infrastructure, bringing the good governance principles to countries that are struggling with it, developing them, and they're kind of like outsourcing the successful laws that have resulted in economic development in China, exporting that to via these special economic zones to the developing world, and using that as sort of a fountain of, one developing the Chinese business profile as we've discussed in other countries, but also having companies, businesses, governments beholden to a legal framework or policy framework that originates in China. So there's definitely that political element there, but ultimately the results of these policies are often successful, not always. I think it's something like a third or so 35% maybe 35% of all zones are profitable. There are roughly 6,500 zones in the world according to our uh, very recent study and development of a map of SEZs that we're working on currently. So fairly good. And then there's kind of like a third breakdown of fully private zones, public-private partnership zones, and public zones. The ones that the Chinese are developing in Africa, for example, are mostly along the lines of public-private partnership. So you have companies that are kind of structured and put together.
Yeah,
Oh
no,
yeah, you're
sorry,
muted. I
sorry,
can
Press.
see you're
Sorry to interrupt
talking.
you. Something that would be really, really interesting to figure out is you say 35% of all SEZs are profitable, and then there's a one-third breakdown of private, public, private, public, I think was the last one. Within the one-third, 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 where's the profitability coming from? Or is it a nice even spread?
So according to the World Bank data, which is regrettably not as recent as we want it to be, um, the I don't remember the exact breakdown on top of my head, unfortunately, but the private zones typically are more profitable than
Makes sense.
the public ones. It's not, overwhelmingly in favor of the fully private
The
zones.
incentives are less
And of course,
complex,
you
I
have the
suppose.
yes, they're less complex, exactly. So, the private zones have an incentive to develop and operate in such a way that kind of
Hmm.
breeds profitability. The public zones don't necessarily have that incentive structure. Things get
Yep.
messy. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and that's a topic of an entire podcast that we can go through
Yeah.
perhaps at a later time. But the uh, but yes, the private zones across the board typically are more
Yeah.
profitable than the public ones. But there are some really interesting examples of private zones being quite unprofitable, and there's some striking examples in India of private zones that are not profitable at all and have been utter failures. But you can find them everywhere in the world, of course. And then obviously the Chinese zones have been immensely profitable. So and then they're basically public, but again complexities there too.